Hey everybody, I hope everybody's doing well after Thanksgiving break. Obviously, as I said in the different updates, we're going to be switching to the fully online version of the course. The reason for that is because there was already a lot of difficulty with everybody being in the same area, as far as being in Pittsburgh, being on campus, or being in the surrounding area, as far as working remotely. I mean, we had to do it that way. That's just the way that it is, considering the circumstances. But when I was thinking about it further, I realized that after the semester was over, people were going to be at home, and that could be all over the place. And then I thought, with different time zones, different access to internet, and other different issues, that could pose a pretty big problem for us all meeting synchronously, which I thought would end up being more of a headache. And then I ended up talking to a few of my colleagues who were also teaching this course and a few other courses, and they were kind of doing something similar to what I decided to do, which was have it be remote, completely online, meaning the lectures will be posted and the students are responsible for listening to them, going through the PowerPoints. But as I also said before in the updates, feel free to email me with any questions, or if you want to meet over the phone or one-on-one via Zoom or as a small group to ask any questions or clarify, I'm fine with doing that too. Okay, so the last time we met before Thanksgiving, we ended our discussion of psychological diagnosis as related to the DSM, right? And we moved into what we were talking about as psychodynamic diagnosis, which is more related to my own practice and my own understanding of therapy and treatment, and kind of understanding suffering in a lot of ways and understanding individual difficulty. As I said before, while the DSM is good for understanding symptoms of different kinds of disorders, right, as outlined in that manual, there are other, even older sort of psychological sort of diagnostic, what's called taxonomies, which just basically means kind of a way of understanding a certain issue, um, that have existed for a long time. The psychodynamic way of understanding suffering predates the medical model of the DSM-3, because as I said in an earlier lecture, the first two DSMs were psychodynamically oriented, and they actually, at least in DSM-1, which only contained about 25 disorders, they were actually classified as what they called reactions, right, as opposed to a disorder, meaning that what the person was experiencing that seemed to be abnormal, right, kind of goes off the beaten path or against the grain of what is considered normal within a particular culture, is based on a reaction to a particular situation or a particular unconscious kind of dynamic, right, as opposed to just being kind of a discrete illness in and of itself, right? But by the time DSM-3 came along in 1980, what had happened was a lot of people were, especially researchers, were complaining about the psychoanalytic orientation of the DSM, because they wanted to use the DSM as a means to study and to research particular psychological problems. Because in research, what you have to do, say you're studying, for example, the impact of a particular psychotherapy, whether it be psychodynamic or CBT or existential, what have you, and we'll talk about those different approaches and the treatment lectures. You have to, what they call, operationalize that, and you also have to have a really solid way of defining what depression is. And if you were a researcher and you didn't have a background in psychodynamic thinking, it became very confusing, right? The psychodynamic manual, because basically what the psychodynamic, for example, what the psychodynamic perspective says about depression, we'll get into this a little bit more perhaps, is that there's an unconscious need to turn the anger that you experience towards a loved person back on the self. So unconsciously, there's a great deal of fear about acknowledging a particular aggressive drive or ambivalence towards somebody that is consciously experienced as loved, right? For example, if I grow up in an environment of neglect and emotional abuse by my father, for example, if I end up being depressed later on in life, meaning that I end up having low mood and I end up, engaging in a lot of self-attacks and just having a great deal of self-esteem issues where I'm constantly telling myself that I'm horrible and I'm awful and I'm a piece of garbage, what that is directing the anger that I have for the person in my life who I consciously love but unconsciously feel a lot of anger towards for mistreating me, right? And instead of acknowledging that anger as being placed with the other, as with my father, for example, I direct it back to myself, right? So that would be an example of a psychodynamic formulation of depression. And there are other ways of understanding that through defense mechanisms and whatnot, and we'll talk about that. But that, unless you have a psychodynamic theoretical background, then you wouldn't be able to diagnose that, because what you would have to do is basically kind of look through a person's history and find that theme and notice where the person was, instead of acknowledging the anger that they would naturally feel towards a person in an environment that felt neglectful or even emotionally abusive, that they tend to turn it on themselves. So what that would look like if you were doing a psychodynamic clinical interview is you get a clear history of the person, and they talk about a lot of these dynamics, maybe of neglect, or they describe an environment that was really emotionally impoverished or emotionally abusive. But when you ask them about the way that they feel towards their parent or towards that loved object, that person, they say that they really love them and they don't have any issues, and what happened in the past is in the past and it doesn't really matter, but then they also have a tendency to really kind of beat themselves up. So you would infer, based on the clinical historical information and what they're kind of doing in the moment and what they're presenting with as far as their symptoms, which is, again, low mood, low self-esteem, low motivation, not feeling like they can do anything right, a tendency to really berate the self, and you make a diagnosis of depression based on the history and what you observe is happening in the room, and eventually including with you as the therapist. Well, researchers didn't want to do that, and they didn't have the background to that, so they wanted something very clear to basically spell out, this is what depression looks like from a symptomatic level. Because in relation to research, you have to identify the problem, and then you have to manipulate the environment in some way, which would be through psychotherapy, and then you have to test the outcome. And you use certain kinds of outcome measures like the Beck Depression Inventory, the Hamilton Depression Inventory, to see if the symptoms got any better, right? So researchers wanted a uniform manual that everybody could understand and that they could use for research. And something else, well, another important thing about the DSM and what people wanted was a uniform manual for people to have a common language, whether they be clinicians or researchers, to talk about psychological problems and to understand people's suffering. But what that ended up doing in a lot of ways was simplifying the suffering of other people, right? Instead of my suffering being understood on this really depthful level, in connection with my history, in connection with inferring what might be going on unconsciously, instead of understanding defense mechanisms and the way that people defend against painful unconscious material, it then just became a system of symptoms. And then what happened with that too was that then psychotherapy got organized around that, and we'll talk about this more perhaps, but this is a good lead in, because from a psychodynamic perspective, diagnosis and treatment are very much connected. Just like I was saying at the beginning of the semester, from a psychodynamic perspective, personality development, diagnosis, and treatment are all intertwined and interconnected. So we'll talk about treatment probably too a little bit as we talk about psychodynamic diagnosis. Right. So the implication of the DSM-3 moving to that more sort of medicalized, symptom-based model was then treatment began to be seen as just a way of eradicating or alleviating symptoms, which can be really helpful for some people, but it misses the point of a long-term psychotherapy relationship, which can actually help to restructure a personality and can have even greater benefits in some ways long-term, as opposed to just helping a person remove their symptoms. And there's research on that too, in terms of CBT, which is basically a model, and we'll again talk about this more when we get into the treatment, is basically a model that identifies symptoms and identifies problems in thinking, right? It basically says that your suffering, your depression, your anxiety, what have you, is connected with faulty thinking, right? And what CBT tries to do is help you identify your faulty thinking patterns and challenge them. And if you can challenge them, then the emotional processes related to that will actually shift. There's a problem with that. The research suggests, even though there's a lot of empirical research on the effectiveness of CBT, there's also research that suggests that the effects don't last very long. Now, this is different for longer term treatments. This is different for psychodynamically longer term treatments and other forms of treatment that are longer term. And what is found there is that after, in the research, after the treatment is completed, that people who have gone through longer term treatment tend to continue to get better, right? This is different when we're thinking about something like CBT or something that's very much just about symptoms, which is just get rid of the symptom, shortest treatment duration possible, what have you, okay? So now that I went off on that spiel a little bit, we can kind of rein it in by, again, talking about how psychodynamic diagnosis is much different in a lot of ways from sort of DSM symptom-based diagnosis. Again, it's older, right? It's a much older tradition. It originates with Freud, right? But it's developed a lot, obviously, over the years because different schools of psychoanalysis develop different ways of understanding people and understanding suffering, right? So I've used the terms psychoanalytic and psychodynamic interchangeably throughout the course, and they are interchangeable in some ways, but there's a lot of political sort of history to it. I think, from my understanding, there was a push towards using the term psychodynamic around World War II, where there was a desire to make psychoanalytic thinking at least seem or represent what Freud felt to be an actual scientific basis more accurately in the language, because it felt like psychoanalytic seemed more intellectual as opposed to science, whereas the term psychodynamic feels more scientific in some ways. And Freud had used the term psychodynamic because he had used in some ways the model of thermodynamics to explain his model of the mind, the idea that energy can never be destroyed but can only be changed. His psychodynamic model of the mind said the same thing. Basically, it was that psychic energy went through this sort of interconnecting dynamic between the id, the ego, the superego, the conscious, the preconscious, and the unconscious, and that the energy can never be destroyed or created, but that it simply flows throughout the different structures, right? So he used some of the laws of thermodynamics to sort of map his psychoanalytic model of the mind onto, right? So that sounded more scientific, so they ended up preferring that term. But also, in more modern times, there seems to be a differentiation between psychoanalytic and psychodynamic in the sense that when people refer to being psychoanalytic, sometimes they're referring to the type of treatment or training, I apologize, that they've gone through. So you can be a psychodynamic or psychoanalytic therapist, right, who has training and has a degree, has a master's or a doctorate degree and is licensed and has gone through training and has gone through study of psychoanalytic theory. But that's different than being a psychoanalyst. A psychoanalyst is somebody who graduates from an actual psychoanalytic institute. Typically, in the olden days, they had to be a doctor, like a medical doctor, but that changed to now you're basically allowed, if you have a master's degree, to in mental health and have some experience, typically, to go through psychoanalytic training. And that's basically what it was back in Freud's day, where you studied psychoanalytic theory in an institute and you went through your own psychoanalysis. You had your own analyst and you went through, 3 to 5 time a week psychoanalysis where you laid on the couch and you went through all the free association. And we'll talk about that stuff later. And you also, like I said, studied the theory and you saw at least 2 psychoanalytic patients and you were supervised by the same person who was psychoanalyzing you. And once it was felt that you were ready, meaning your own analysis was complete and that you were prepared to successfully psychoanalyze others, you were granted the certification of psychoanalyst. So that's one distinction, right? So more often than not, if you're a doctorate level person who is interested in psychoanalytic thinking and you have training in that direction, but you're not a psychoanalyst, you typically refer to yourself as psychodynamic. Not always, but typically. Another thing, too, is that psychoanalytic, the term, tends to be associated with some of the earlier contributors, such as Freud. Like if you're more aligned with Freud or somebody like Klein or somebody who we're not going to really talk about, whose name is Jacques Lacan, but he was a French psychoanalyst. I don't talk about Lacan because I don't understand his theory. It's ridiculously incomprehensible, in my opinion. And also in other people's opinions, including Melanie Klein, who basically said the same thing. But if you were associated with those folks, those more classically oriented psychoanalysts, then you would maybe refer to yourself as psychoanalytic. Whereas if you were more in the object relations school, or if you took a little bit more of a wider perspective in psychoanalysis, like maybe you pulled from different schools of psychoanalytic theory, you'd call yourself psychodynamic, right? That just gives a little bit of background into those terms and the history of those terms and what those terms mean. If you are a psychology major, and I know I only have one, I know Kaylin, but if anybody else, like I've said before, goes on to study any more psychology, you're going to come across these terms more and more. And I definitely know throughout the psychology program, you're going to come into contact with more and more psychoanalytic thinking, including when you go on to take theories of personality. Yeah. So, as opposed to the DSM diagnostic system, which was oriented towards sort of the identification of symptom-based disorders, psychodynamic diagnosis involves the identification of what is called a person's personality structure or organization. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about personality as it's sort of defined or understood from a psychodynamic perspective. Typically, when we think about personality, and we're talking about it from a psychodiagnostic perspective, we think about personality disorder, right? It's almost as if like personality only exists if you have a disorder, right? It seems like from the from the DSM perspective. But the psychodynamic tradition rejects that notion. Everybody has a personality structure, everybody has a personality organization, and each personality structure exists on a continuum from health to psychopathology to really severe psychopathology. And when we're talking about severe psychopathology, what we're talking about is psychotic versions of different personality styles or types, right? And we talked about this a little bit in the last class. Well, and I should say too that symptomology is important from a psychodynamic perspective in understanding suffering. It's not like we're like, oh, the person is reporting all these depressive symptoms, but that doesn't matter because we're just interested in personality. Symptoms are important because they give us a clue into the way that the personality is organized and the way that the defenses are becoming enacted in some way. Okay. So we talked a little bit about the 3 different levels of personality organization. I'm going to stop here too for a second and just say that I know, again, as I've said throughout the semester, that some of this stuff is not typically taught in a Psych 150 class. This is, again, stuff that you might get exposed to higher up in psych classes like 300-400s, or maybe not even until grad school. So again, I'm just interested in exposing you to some of these ideas. When I ask questions on the test about this stuff, it's going to be, like I said, very, very basic, just about terminology. And I do think that eventually if you do go on to study more psychology, and if you do end up studying anything psychodynamic or depth oriented, that even if this stuff doesn't feel like it really hits home or makes a whole lot of sense right now, at least later on when you get reintroduced to it, something might click again. Something familiar might emerge in the terminology or in some of the people that we talked about that might help to kind of bring back some of that memory. So again, I recognize completely that this is not a I don't want to say appropriate because I don't think it's inappropriate, but this isn't typical for what gets taught at a Psych 150 level. And again, if I ask a question, it'll be simple. For example, like I said in the last class, if I ask about 3 levels of personality organization, I might just ask that. I might ask, what are the 3 levels of personality organization? Or from a psychodynamic diagnostic perspective, what are the 3 levels of personality organization? And then you just have to tell me, right? Or I might say, let's see. In which level of personality organization is an individual organized around advanced or secondary defense mechanisms? So that information is all on this chart. You would just have to go and look for it. So you see that the neurotic level of personality organization is organized around advanced or secondary defense mechanisms. Okay. So here we have the 3 levels, and there are different theoretical positions that are associated with each. We talked about, I'm not going to get a whole lot into this, but we talked about Freud's Oedipal phase, right? And people who are organized around unconsciously the Oedipal phase, that period of time when, the Oedipal drama has dissolved, the young child is identified with the parent of the opposite sex, Castration anxiety has ensued, and the way of dealing with that was through the identification, and that whole like desire to possess the parent of the same or the opposite sex has dissolved. People who are unconsciously linked towards that and unconscious guilt related to that position, right? Related to that period when they wanted to destroy the parent of the opposite sex or the same sex and possess the parent of the opposite sex. But people who are organized around that period unconsciously and guilt associated with that are Oedipally organized, and they're the neurotic level people, right? Whereas people in the borderline phase are oriented unconsciously towards other earlier developmental phases, such as the anal phase, right, or the oral phase, right. And psychotic level people are considered orally organized, meaning that their personality, their fixation, their developmental period that sort of organizes the personality is very early on, right? Just as a few examples. Or for Klein, people who are neurotic or in the depressive position, right? They tend to be oriented towards guilt, towards unconscious transgression, towards loved objects, right? So that would be considered a more neurotic, from a Kleinian perspective, organization. Whereas a borderline and a psychotic person is more in that split phase. We talked about Klein and the way of like splitting our understanding of self and other, right? And projecting a lot of our own impulses onto other people and experiencing them as coming from outside, right, as opposed to internally, right? So yeah, neurotic people are organized around advanced defense mechanisms, and we'll talk about what those are specifically, whereas borderline and psychotic level organized people are oriented or organized around primary or primitive defense mechanisms. So then we'll talk about reality testing and identity diffusion, because this is the other thing that really organizes or identifies where a person is in terms of their level of personality organization. Reality testing basically means that the person has the ability to understand the difference between fantasy or what's going on internally and external reality, right? There are people that don't hallucinate. There are people that don't really have delusions. It's not like you can't get a little bit suspicious every once in a while or what have you of people's motives, because we all can. But generally people are able, if their reality testing is intact, they're able to understand that they're able to participate in consensually agreed upon reality, and they can differentiate between what might be going on internally as fantasy and what's going on externally. So for somebody who is psychotic, what happens is their internal fantasy, or what gets stirred up, becomes reality to them. Like if they have this thought or feeling that somebody's out to get them, instead of being able to say that's just a thought or that's just something that's internal or whatever, they run with it, and they can't differentiate between that fantasy and what's going on. So they develop delusions and beliefs about the self and other that orient around that. And they may also have active hallucinations if it goes into schizophrenia. And if you're a psychotic level person, you don't have to necessarily be schizophrenic. It just means that your beliefs are so rigid that they go into the direction of delusion in some way. Like your belief that other people are out to get you all the time is so strong that it veers off into the level of psychosis. Not necessarily that you have to be hallucinating or anything like that. You also might be able to function really well and be at the psychotic level of personality organization and not necessarily schizophrenic from a DSM perspective. Okay. So that's reality testing. And now identity diffusion basically is the sense of self that is continuous in some ways. Like I have an understanding of my past, my present, and what I desire for the future. My identity is stable. I understand myself in terms of my gender expression, my sexual orientation, my value systems, my talents, my interests, my goals, my desires are all pretty solid. They don't shift too much. I mean, for everybody, goals and values shift as we age and as we develop, but there's some sense of continuity. There's some sense of being able to kind of talk about a narrative of experience, which is not true for people at the borderline or psychotic level of organization, particularly the borderline level where everything is very chaotic. Sense of self, values, Interests, goals are all very chaotic. Interpersonal relationships are very chaotic because my understanding of self and my understanding of others shifts really dramatically. There isn't an ability to hold the complexity of my own experience and my understanding of other people. Yeah. So that is what is meant. And I should also say, too, when I'm talking about stability of identity and I'm talking about sexual orientation and I'm talking about gender, it doesn't necessarily mean that we ascribe to society's ideas about that. Like, if you're gay or a lesbian or bisexual, um, it doesn't mean that you don't. It doesn't mean that you have identity diffusion. You still have a solid understanding of your sexual experience, right, and your sexual identity. So that is not considered identity diffusion. That's considered a normal part of identity cohesion, right? It's just when people shift a lot in that and they have difficulty understanding their sexual desires or their sexual orientation, that's when it becomes, maybe this is controversial and different analysts would have different things to say about this, a question about identity integration. Okay. So it's if my understanding of self is really shaky, if it shifts very quickly, people who are at the borderline level, depending on their particular personality organization, personality type, which we'll talk about those in a little bit, have a tendency to mold towards the identities of other people. So if they get into a relationship or a friendship with somebody who has a particular interest or carries themselves in a particular way or wears certain types of clothing or would be sort of categorized in a certain way, they tend to take on those characteristics. And the reason for that, and I should also mention that that's normal developmentally to a certain degree too. Like when we're adolescents, we do that because we're still coming into our understanding of identity. But if we're getting into later adolescence and our early adulthood and we're still doing that constantly, there's a question about our identity cohesion, right? We need other people to help us to hold together our identity and our understanding of ourselves when we're at the borderline level of personality organization. Okay, so we talked about reality testing. Self and object relations remain split in the psychotic level. Yeah, so the major differentiation between the borderline and the psychotic level would be reality testing. People at the borderline level can largely reality test, right? They can understand that there's a difference between fantasy, what goes on externally, generally. But what happens when people at the borderline level are in distress is that they can have what are called micropsychotic reactions. I actually went through this experience with, and this case unfortunately turned out pretty tragic. But I had this experience with a young woman I was working with when I worked for an ACT team, which is an assertive community treatment team, when I was working as a psychotherapist. On that team, I was meeting with this young woman for about a year and a half, 2 years. I had a really solid therapeutic relationship with her. She had a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder, but from a psychodynamic perspective, I saw some of that, but I also saw a lot of health, and I saw a person who had a lot of trauma and a lot of really adverse experiences. She was also somebody who, throughout her development, tended to mature, and from my psychodynamic perspective, she was moving a little bit more towards the neurotic space. And part of our work together was helping to build a realistic sense of self-esteem, but also helping to build a realistic sense of relation to other people, because she would tend to get really upset with people and cut people out if they tended to frustrate her. One thing we talked about was when her friend was like, she had a friend who tended to be late sometimes, and she would get really, really upset. And working with her, one thing that we worked through was trying to develop an understanding of why that person might have been late, or a thinking through of how her feelings might relate to other developmental spaces earlier on in life when people weren't there for her, right? So she ended up really progressing a lot, even to the point where she went back to school, and she moved into a new apartment that was a lot nicer than the apartment she was in. And she stayed in the apartment she was in before because she didn't feel like she deserved anything better. She didn't think that she'd be able to keep up with anything better. But through working through psychotherapy, she ended up feeling that she could have something better, and she moved. So around Easter of 2016, though, she ended up reconnecting with her family, her father's family, who she hadn't seen in a long time. And the family system dynamics are very complicated to get into, but the father had died in Mayview State Hospital and was diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder. Um, and she really idealized her father while also really vilifying her mother. Her mother was seen as like the one who was really awful and was really terrible and was the one that really mistreated her. And from a psychodynamic perspective, when that happens and the other parent is idealized, there's some sense of knowledge that that's probably the person where the real conflict is, right? Where the person with the parent who is idealized. Well, what ended up happening was that she reconnected with this her father's family, some cousins and an uncle around Easter of 2016. And she'd gone to their house for Easter dinner. And what happened after that was she developed kind of a psychosis. She actually ended up being hospitalized a few times, and it was a really, really rough ride. Um, and I won't get into all the details, but what I think happened was when she went to her uncle's house, I think that it triggered unconsciously a memory of some kind of trauma. And I think what that trauma was that she had been sexually abused either by her father or by her father's brother, the uncle, in the house, because that house had been in the family for a while. And I think that in order to not have to deal with what was getting triggered, that a psychotic reaction ensued. So for people who are at the borderline level of personality, they tend to have a history of intense trauma often, especially early trauma in the family, right? Very early adverse experiences of caregiving, neglect, abuse, confusion, having to contain the anxiety of the family in some ways. And that seemed to be pretty clear from this person. I always had a sense that there was probably some kind of trauma in her life that we hadn't really been able to work through. And I had some sense that it had to deal with her father because, again, she idealized her father so much. I felt that that was a way of kind of warding off the trauma. But when the psychotic reaction started happening and it was related to coming in contact with her father's family, I felt like that provided more evidence from this, from a psychological, psychoanalytic perspective, that there probably had been some kind of pretty bad trauma that I hadn't been aware of, kind of coming to the surface. So that's an example of the way in which reality testing is intact for people who have borderline or in the borderline level of personality, but can become compromised during periods of stress or perhaps when some kind of trauma is being unearthed. So we talked about defense mechanisms, right? These are the individual's way unconsciously of avoiding or managing some powerful, threatening feeling, usually anxiety, but sometimes overwhelming grief, shame, envy, and other disorganizing emotional responses, as well as the individual's way of maintaining self-esteem, right? So this is the way that I manage my anxiety. I manage what might be kind of coming up into my conscious from the unconscious that, for whatever reason, is very difficult to deal with. If we're talking about a Freudian perspective, it's the way that the ego mediates the sexual and aggressive desires of the id and the punitive, sadistic, moralistic pressure from the superego, right? And we talked about when we talked about Freud, we talked about certain defense mechanisms such as repression and reaction formation, right? But there are a slew of other ones, and they break off into two different categories, primary and secondary. Excuse me. And the reason why they are divided into two levels is because they're associated with different developmental spaces. Primitive defense mechanisms are, from this theoretical frame, associated with early development, like going back to infancy, right? These are the ways that infants and very small children dealt with difficulties in their internal world and in their external world, right? Meaning if there was something going on that was really anxiety provoking or really impinging or really painful to deal with in the external world, they would use primary defense mechanisms, primitive defense mechanisms to deal with that, right? And that has to do with development too, because that's where the child's at. That's where their ability is in terms of their ability to defend against difficult internal and external stimuli or experience, right? Whereas advanced defense mechanisms come online later, right? They're considered healthier because they're considered more developmentally appropriate for somebody who is later on in life. Okay. So primary defense mechanisms, and we'll go through them, are extreme withdrawal, denial, omnipotent control, extreme idealization, and devaluation. Okay, so if I ask again about these on a test or something, it will literally be something like, give me 3 examples of primary or primitive defense mechanisms. Or I might say something like, define omnipotent control, and you'll have the information that you need. Okay. Extreme withdrawal, the tendency to escape from or avoid situations that may be experienced as emotionally or psychologically challenging. And I have here, and we'll talk about these later, the different personality or character types that are associated with each defense. And what that, we'll talk about the different character types, because we have the 3 levels of personality organization, but then we have the specific character types that can exist within that range somewhere. Okay, and so I have each character type that tends to organize around that particular defense, because as we'll talk about, with specific personality types, there are specific defense mechanisms associated with each. So for schizoid people, they tend to use extreme withdrawal. They tend to pull away from other people. They tend to live very solitary lives. They tend to be internally drawn, right? And the reason for that is because they're, from a psychoanalytic perspective or psychodynamic perspective, their early environment was experienced as really critical and impinging, and they also had a very natural tendency to be very introverted and sensitive emotionally. So their way of dealing with an environment of criticism and impingement and difficulty was to withdraw into an internal world of fantasy, or to withdraw physically and to kind of have their own physical space away from other people. Okay, denial, the existence of unpleasant internal or external realities, is denied and kept out of conscious awareness, right? And that's associated with the manic or hypomanic personality. Omnipotent control, a sense that one can influence or control one's surroundings, that one has agency, as a critical dimension of self-esteem, right? Power is related to my self-esteem. If I can have power over other people or power in a situation, I feel that I'm in control and I can ward off my vulnerability, right? And that is associated with narcissism to a certain degree, but also with psychopathic personality styles, right? Another is extreme idealization and devaluation. And this goes back to that splitting that we talked about, the belief that some benevolent, all-powerful authority is in charge, and then to then see that same person in a deflated way that strips the individual of all power, intelligence, attraction, right? I see people as either good or bad, and I can't integrate my understanding of people as complex beings. And this is associated with narcissistic personality. So that might be another question I ask too. I might say, which character type is the defense of extreme idealization and devaluation associated with? And again, the answer would be narcissistic. And again, you would have all of that information available to you here in the lecture and in the PowerPoint. Okay, and then we have projection. What is inside an impulse, behavior, or emotional state is seen as coming from the outside. Okay, I can't deal with my own anger or my own sexual impulse or my own particular desire because for some reason it's too threatening to my conscious self. So I put it out into the world and I see it as part of other people. And that projection is related to many different versions of borderline and psychotic personality, but the paranoid personality type tends to really organize its experience around this particular defense mechanism, right? Instead of owning their own aggression or understanding that they have an aggressive impulse, they put it on other people and they see that as coming back at them. So they put their aggression on other people and they feel that other people are coming after them and are trying to hurt them or are trying to do something wrong to them in some way. Introjection, what is outside is misunderstood as coming from inside. When we talked about the example of depression from a psychodynamic perspective, we talked about how a child who grows up with a father who's really critical, right, who's really critical or potentially abusive in some way, might take that badness in, instead of seeing it as part of the father or the developmental figure who mistreated them, they see it as part of the self. They see it as their badness as opposed to the badness of the other, right? We talked about how that direction of the anger and the aggression back towards the self is what fuels a lot of depression and depressive experience from this perspective. Projective identification. This one's complicated. We talked about this when we talked about Klein. An individual's handling of a difficult internal state is by projecting it onto another person. as well as behaving in a manner towards the other person that causes the other person to behave the way that reinforces the projection. Again, this exists for paranoid people and most borderline level psychologies, including psychopathic. It's basically like, so for people who are in the borderline level and they organize around projective identification, what happens is that they can't see certain parts of experience as part of them in the moment. Like say their anger gets stirred up, what happens is they still feel it, but their way of dealing with it and not recognizing it as really truly part of them is by putting it in you. Like then they see you as being angry with them, but then they react to you as if you're going to attack them, so they treat you in a way that actually makes you want to defend yourself. So then you end up acting out the projection that comes from their own need to kind of disavow or not recognize that particular emotion. Again, I know this stuff is complicated. Splitting organizes experience by assigning good and bad valences to everything, right? We talked about like seeing people as either good or bad and not being able to integrate that. Okay. And then the secondary or advanced defense mechanisms are repression, motivated forgetting or ignoring. You know, most neurotic level personalities use this just to a certain degree. It's really associated with the hysterical personality. And the reason why that is because it goes back to Freud's theory of hysteria, which was about, you know, the unconscious sexual and aggressive desires that became manifest in neurotic symptoms, right? And we talked about early on hysteria being connected with the unexplained medical phenomena that wasn't related to any organic cause, such as muscle or glove paralysis, blindness, mutism, any kind of full paralysis, right? Any kind of seemingly neurological issue that didn't have an organic cause. Regression is a slide backwards into the habits of a prior maturational phase, right? If you regress, you know, say when you're in a state of sadness or difficulty, you might overeat. You know, that would be considered a slide back into an oral way of kind of dealing with things, right? Or if you're when you're really anxious and you become very meticulous and you kind of hoard things and you are very kind of controlling over the environment, or you go into a cleaning frenzy, that might be considered a slide back to the anal phase. Okay, isolation of affect, you know, the emotional part of an experience is separated from the cognitive dimension. This one's really related to obsessive compulsive personalities, right? So people who are obsessive compulsive in their personality organization tend to be a little bit robotic. They have difficulty with emotional expression unless it's anger. They're okay with anger to a certain degree, but only if they feel that their need for meticulousness or their standards have not been lived up to. That's when anger gets activated. But other than that, anger actually is a pretty difficult emotion for people who are obsessive compulsive to feel. They tend to be more prone to feel anxiety, right? And a lot of their control and meticulousness is a way of kind of modulating that, right? Because what obsessive compulsive people are actually really afraid of from a psychoanalytic perspective is their own unconscious aggression, right? And their own unconscious desire to be messy in a lot of ways, because they're organized around the anal phase that we talked about. When people who are obsessive compulsive are considered anal characters because they're considered to be organized from that developmental space, right? They grew up in an environment that perhaps was really meticulous, really controlling, really subverted the child's need for autonomy and their natural striving for independence. They were told what to wear, what to eat, how to behave. They were taught that sexuality was inappropriate, right? That's one version of the obsessive compulsive environment that somebody grows up in that develops that character style. The other is one that's completely chaotic, right? Completely chaotic and messy and crazy. And the child has to develop a version of self that is really neat and really capable and really competent and really meticulous and really self-controlled as a way to survive. And then that gets carried on into their later life, right? Intellectualization, talking about feelings in a way that seems emotionless. So again, people who are obsessive compulsive tend to talk about emotions and not feel them. They tend to split off their emotions, particularly certain versions of anger, especially at earlier developmental figures, and talk about things in a very emotionless, very cognitive, very intellectual way, right? People who are intellectualizers can think things through to the nth degree, but the ability to kind of mark it with a real emotional experience is not quite there, right? Rationalization, find or make a reason for everything one has in mind to do, right? Most neurotic level personality or organizations relate to this, including masochistic. Now, the next one is really connected with masochism. So, moralization, again, another secondary or advanced defense mechanism. One seeks ways to feel that it is one's duty to proceed with a certain course. This is often used to manage unconscious guilt or envy, right? So, masochistic people are associated with this. And basically, what masochism is doing for others or causes to such a hearty extent that it ignores or even in sometimes undermines the individual's own need. So people who are masochistic work themselves to the bone, and their self-esteem is organized around helping others. And sometimes when it gets to the level that it might be considered a personality issue, it's become so hardy that they completely just dismiss their own needs or the idea that they need anything at all. Their self-esteem is so organized around doing for others, right? And it's related to this idea that that was their only way of kind of getting any kind of love or affection or connection, even as a small child, was their need to mold to the expectations and needs of others, as opposed to having their own needs as a small child met, right? And working with masochistic people in psychotherapy can be really difficult because they just constantly defend against and deny their own needs. And they have a tendency, and I'm working with somebody now who comes to mind in private practice who is really organized around some of these defenses, where I have to constantly call attention to his tendency to talk about other people when I ask him to talk about himself. When we get into this space where he starts to talk about himself, he veers off into talking about other people and what he does for other people and how much that means to him. And I have to call attention to that, and I have to say, well, let's get back to you. And I have to say something like, I'm noticing that every time that we start to talk about you and your experience, right, that you pretty quickly go off into talking about other people and what you've done for other people and what that means to other people and about their lives. And I'm wondering how we can make sense of that. And another thing too that you have to work with masochistic level people is to unearth some of the emotion related to some of the early losses, because they defend against this. This young man that I'm talking about came from an environment where his father left really early and developed another family and never really had much contact or connection with him throughout his life. But when we talk about it, he just avoids the pain. He avoids the idea that it means anything. And he says instead that, well, that experience taught me to be a better parent. Well, that's great. That's good. You know, it's great to learn from those experiences, but I'm much more curious about what you feel when you think about the fact that your father abandoned you and developed this other family and you felt completely neglected. So working with masochistic people can be very difficult, and it requires calling attention to the defense mechanisms that are used to kind of uphold this idea that other people's needs are more important than mine, and my self-esteem hinges on the needs of other people. Okay, compartmentalization permits two conflicting conditions to exist without conscious confusion, shame, guilt, or anxiety, right? It's like an example of compartmentalization would be somebody who, like, this would also maybe kind of be a little bit of a reaction formation, but like a preacher who like is, you know, anti-pornography, you know, in his outward ways of being and speaking, who then goes on to have a whole stash of pornography, right? And we're not talking about like, you know, child pornography. We're just talking about consensual pornography necessarily. I mean, that would be a whole different problem. But so those experiences are compartmentalized. Somebody who does that can both have this sense that they're morally upright and that pornography is wrong, and then also have this stash of pornography at the same time. So that would be considered a compartmentalization. Undoing is the unconscious effort to counterbalance some affect, usually guilt or shame, with an attitude or behavior that will somehow erase it. So, an example of this, and this is also associated with obsessive compulsive people, particularly compulsive people who are more organized around doing than thinking. So, if I use undoing as a defense mechanism, I might have a angry internal impulse or monologue about somebody that I'm close with, but I'm upset with them about something. But it's again too difficult for me to really acknowledge that or really sit with the idea that I might be angry at somebody or really to have a discussion about that with the person. So I feel so guilty about the fact that I even had the impulse or the thought that I, without even really telling them what it was for, I'd buy them lunch or I give them flowers or I buy them a bottle of wine or I even pay them like an overly nice compliment that maybe even seems a little bit phony, right? To undo, right, that transgression that was maybe even just internal, right, or felt as internal because it linked with the anger that was associated with feeling slighted or feeling looked over or what have you. Okay, turning against the self, the redirection of some negative affect or attitude from an external object towards the self is associated with depressive psychology. Again, it's like we talked about turning that anger that I might have towards an early developmental figure back onto the self and not really recognizing it as part of the self. And in therapy with depressive people, what part of what you have to do is get them to acknowledge or to feel the emotions that connect with other people and get them to recognize that part of what they're feeling is due to their external environment and not because of their own badness, right? And it's okay. We all have bad and we all have good. We're complicated. But for depressive people, the bad part, the bad object is just really powerful. So in working with people who are depressed, you have to offer a lot of support and you also have to offer an environment where you can explore the environment and reconfigure the understanding of self, where some of the badness that gets taken up is actually part of the environment, not part of them. Okay. Then there's displacement. I'm just going to go through the rest of these really quick. Displacement, a redirection of a drive, emotion, a preoccupation, or behavior from its initial or natural object to another because its original is for some reason anxiety ridden, right? Reaction formation, turning something into its polar opposite in order to render it less threatening. So, and this is really associated with obsessive compulsive people too. So if I'm feeling anger and it's slipping into my consciousness, I might go the other way and be overly kind, right? Or I might go the other way if I'm feeling like I'm being, because one thing for obsessive compulsive people is they feel easily controlled by others, and that elicits unconscious anger or conscious anger too sometimes. But that's difficult to sit with. So what might happen is that they become overly dutiful to some degree. But then there's like that, then there is that tension that comes up between being overly dutiful and then feeling controlled and then wanting to be overly dutiful because they feel guilty about the anger that comes up and also being worried about the way that the other person might treat them, right? Worried about being fired if they don't submit, which causes anger. So it's an interesting kind of cycle. Reversal, enacting a scenario that switches one position from subject to object. Identification, capacity to identify with another person or with some aspect of another person. Sublimation, turning biologically based impulses into a socially valued form. Talked about that when we talked about Freud. Humor, the use of jokes in order to protect the self from difficult or threatening emotional material. Okay. And then for some reason this goes back to, sorry about this is a mistake. Some reason this goes back to primary or primitive defense mechanisms, but these are considered part of the earlier ones. Somatization, the expression of unconscious feelings in depleted bodily states. Acting out, expression of unverbalized states of being by acting out. So instead of being able to talk about something, they instead act it out, right? When we talk about like people acting out, like you're acting out right now, that's kind of what we're talking about. Instead of being able to talk through what's going on, they kind of act it out by becoming really erratic or angry or aggressive, or even very sexualized. Sexualization, unconscious intention to convert terror, pain, or other overwhelming intention into excitement. That's also called instinctualization. And extreme dissociation. Dissociation after confronted with a catastrophe that overwhelms an individual's capacity to cope, especially if it involves unbearable pain or terror. This is dissociative psychologies in some hysterical or histrionic personalities. Okay, as we said, personality exists on a continuum from neurotic, healthy to compromised, borderline, and psychotic. Personality types tend to cluster at certain levels of personality. For example, hysterical, depressive, obsessive compulsive personalities tend to cluster at the neurotic level of personality organization, while schizoid, narcissistic, and psychopathic personalities tend to organize at the borderline level of functioning. Now, a lot of this work comes from two people. Nancy McWilliams, who we've been reading some of her work, and I have a couple of videos of hers to watch where she describes some issues in personality diagnosis and in psychotherapy, and one about when she talks about types of narcissism. And I love her for a few reasons. One, I love the simplicity of her language, even though she's talking about really complex concepts. And I love the way that she's integrated so many years of psychoanalytic literature and theory into what I consider to be pretty digestible writing. And her probably she has many book chapters and whatnot, but three very famous books: Psychoanalytic Diagnosis, Psychoanalytic Psychotherapy, and Psychoanalytic Case Formulation. The basic therapy processes chapter that we're reading right now is from her book Psychoanalytic Psychotherapy, and the Why Diagnose chapter is from her book Psychoanalytic Diagnosis. And what she does is she has collected all of this different literature, and she's organized the psychoanalytic thinking into these different personality styles. And she also talks about the levels of personality organization. And the levels of the personality types that she identifies that have emerged through psychoanalytic literature over the past 100 years are psychopathic, narcissistic, schizoid, paranoid, depressive, manic and hypomanic, masochistic, obsessive compulsive, hysterical, and dissociative. There are other personality types too, like the dependent and the phobic and the counter-dependent and the sadistic, but she doesn't really talk too much about those. But there's another book called the Psychodynamic Diagnostic Manual that does. Okay. And again, it has all of the different types and the different levels where they tend to cluster, right? Meaning that they use certain levels of defense mechanisms, right? And we also talked about how each personality style is associated with particular defense mechanisms, right? As well. That's what part of the differentiation between level. We identify level based on level of defense mechanism, reality testing, and identity cohesion, and specific types of defense mechanisms, as well as other kinds of developmental themes that seem to emerge. Okay. And the other person, I was saying McWilliams is one person where this sort of diagnostic system comes from, but an earlier person where this comes from too is a man named Otto Kernberg, who is still alive today. He's in his 90s, but he's a psychoanalyst. He's still practicing. He is teaching at, I believe, Cornell Medical College. So especially the levels of personality organization, the neurotic, borderline, psychotic, especially the borderline personality organization, he was really the one that put that on the map, right? That whole idea of a borderline level of personality. Okay. And then we identify personality types through themes that emerge, right? And through core conflicts, the defense mechanisms, both the level and the specific, object relations, including relational patterns, and the quality of symptoms. I didn't go through all of these, but I did 4 examples and broke these down into those different kinds of ways that we identify. And I did narcissistic, psychopathic, depressive, and obsessive compulsive. So we'll just go through this quickly because we're getting at an hour. So for the narcissistic person, the themes that they're oriented around are envy versus gratitude and superiority versus inferiority. So when we think about narcissistic people, we often think about people who are very grandiose, have a really high, at least outwardly, have a very high sense of their own worth. That becomes very exaggerated in their superiority. They require the admiration of other people, but they don't give that in return often, right? So on the outside, there's this huge grandiose version of self, the self that needs admired, the self that fantasies about its possibility for immense wealth and power and fame, right? The self that sees Itself is incredibly attractive, right? So what that is in some ways is a defending against what is actually unconsciously a feeling of incredible inferiority, right? This, what Kernberg calls the grandiose self structure, which is what I just described, is used to ward off this actual feeling of worthlessness and inferiority. And for a lot of people who are narcissistic, even though there is this unconscious self experience of worthlessness and inferiority, their defenses are so strong that they can ward that off so well that they may never come in contact with it, at least until later on when they begin to get older, when they begin to feel that they have less power, when their relationships begin to dwindle, when people don't pay as much attention to them, when they're unable to command the room and command other people as much, they become depressed. And that's when they begin to have a breakdown in their narcissistic defenses and when they begin to feel depressed, right? Another thing for people with narcissistic personality organization from this perspective is that they can't tolerate envy. And that's why they have the grandiose self structure and the narcissistic defenses, because if they contain all the goodness and if they're perfect, then there's nothing to envy in anybody else, right? They ward off. It's normal to feel envious about certain things, but they ward off the feeling of envy by destroying or belittling others, right? So if I demean you or if I devalue you, then it means that there's nothing to envy because I can't handle the idea of the possibility that I might envy something in you. Another thing for narcissistic people is that they're terrified of dependence, normal dependence that we all feel for other people, for relationships, for connection with others, for friendship. They defend against that in their grandiose self because, again, if they're all good, that means that they don't have to depend on anybody else. And the only time that they really get into relationship with other people is when they meet people who really admire them and are basically willing to kind of like go to stoke their ego to no end, or when they meet people who they idealize, who they can kind of bask in their glory in some ways. Like if they meet somebody who they see as being idealized, they connect with them because they feel that if they connect with that person, then they get to feel some of that idealization themselves. They get to take it with them as well. Okay, the core conflicts are associated with borderline personality organization. This is pre-Oedipal stuff. People who become narcissistic often grow up in environments where the needs of their parents were more important than their own, right? It wasn't so much an attunement to what the child needed emotionally or in terms of caregiving. It was only if the child was performing and only if the child could be seen as kind of, I don't know exactly how to say this, but if the parent was able to use the child as a narcissistic extension, meaning if the child was performing to make the parent look good or feel good, that's the only time that they ever got any kind of accolade or any kind of praise or any kind of love, right? So their self structure becomes one of a false self. So they learn that the only way to gain the appreciation of other people is through performing and is through achieving and is through doing right, instead of just being treated as a worthy human being just for being alive, which is part of what a parent's duty is to do, is to instill the sense that a child is worth something just for being alive and that their emotional experience is okay, right? Narcissistic individuals did not have that. They never had the environment that allowed them to develop this sense that they were worthy, even if they weren't performing, even if they were just being who they naturally want to be, okay? So we talked about the object relation. Self and self-esteem are connected to the needs and expectation of others. Relationships are deadened by their need for admiration and connection with idealized other, right? Narcissistic individuals will sometimes later in life become aware that their relationships are deadened. Depression ensues when they are no longer able to keep up with their narcissistic defenses. So we talked about that. Psychopathic. People who are psychopathic. Let me tell you too, narcissistic, like I said, there's a video to watch with Nancy McWilliams where she talks about the different types of narcissism. One is the overt, one is the covert, thin-skinned, thick-skinned. Yeah. psychopathic personality structure. And there's a video associated with this too, with a young woman who was diagnosed as a psychopath. She's kind of a pro-social psychopath in the sense that she has like a lot of the traits of it, but she's able to actually, like, she has enough insight where she's able to kind of like be pro-social. You'll see what I mean. It's interesting. But yeah, she has enough insight into her psychopathy where she's able to kind of make choices that help her to actually really participate usefully in society. And when we think about psychopath, we might think about people who are like serial killers and whatnot, or like burglars, or just hardened criminals, and that's not necessarily always the case. Many psychopaths are just like normal people who are like doing their thing, who don't necessarily even get into legal trouble. But it's again just like it's associated with certain defense mechanisms and certain themes, right? And the themes for the psychopath are control versus powerlessness, vulnerability versus power, and power versus shame. So basically, they need to feel powerful in order to ward off the feeling of being vulnerable. And from a psychoanalytic perspective, at least when we're talking about mild and moderate versions of psychopathy, the reason why they're psychopathic is that they grew up in an environment that was very traumatic, right? Was very insecure, was very chaotic, was very impinging. But their way of dealing with that was to fantasize about their power. So their environment was incredibly chaotic and incredibly difficult, right? And their way of dealing with that was by fantasizing about their control and the fact that they can have so much power that they can overcome and deal with anything, right? So when they get into relationship with other people, it's usually very exploitive. And the reason why that is because, again, because of their environment and their tendency to use the defense mechanism of omnipotent control, they need to be able to control other people or feel control over other people or manipulate other people, because that wards off those really deeply unconscious feelings of powerlessness and shame and vulnerability, right? We talked about the childhoods of antisocial people being rife with insecurity and chaos. Relationships are exploitive and people are seen as objects. This control helps a psychopath ward off their feelings of powerlessness and vulnerability, right? Often admitted to treatment due to legal involvement, right? They lack empathy for other people. They consciously manipulate other people, right? There's a lot written on the neurobiology of people who are psychopathic too. When it comes to brain structure, there's a lot of theorizing that they don't feel anxiety for certain reasons because of certain neurotransmitter malfunctions, right? They also tend to need a high level of emotional stimulation because of that, right? They tend to be impulsive sometimes. That tends to get them in trouble, you know? Their lack of anxiety, right? And their high threshold for emotional stimulation tends to get them in trouble because they need a lot to stimulate themselves. So they end up committing crimes sometimes. And again, I don't necessarily mean like serial killing or violent crimes. It might be shoplifting or a variety of other things, right? Okay. And we talked a lot about depressive and obsessive compulsive. Let me remind, so we have the video of that too. The narcissistic video with Nancy McWilliams, the psychopathic video with the young woman being interviewed, where she's more of what would be called a pro-social psychopath. And then we talked about depression, depressive personality, and obsessive compulsive. And maybe we'll talk more about that when we talk about treatment. So this ends this lecture, discussion, what have you, on both psychodynamic diagnosis and also kind of getting into psychotherapy, right, and treatment. Right. We'll get more into the other psychotherapy treatment in the next lecture. We'll talk about biological basis and different kinds of types of psychotherapy. So please just, obviously if you've gotten to this point, you've listened to the lecture, come to me with any questions that you have about anything. Again, any material that's on the exam will be really straightforward, right? If I say something like, as an example, I might say, identify the defense mechanisms associated with depressive personality structure. And you can go to the slide and you can see them, right? Introjection and turning against the self. So they'll be that straightforward if I ask questions about this, and I will. Or if I might say something like, Identify 2 themes that organize the obsessive compulsive personality. You can give me an example of any of the ones in the theme column. You can say neatness versus messiness, and control versus discontrol, or you can say omnipotence versus vulnerability, and autonomy versus shame. So, yeah. So, thank you again. Please come to me with any questions. And, good luck. I won't see anybody necessarily unless people come to me with questions or anything before the end of the semester. So, I hope everybody has a good break.